Hi, everyone. First off, you'll have to excuse my hair. It is Sunday after all. I'm just sort of relaxing on the deck having a coffee. I had recorded and uploaded a video a couple of weeks ago about the group of doctors that had some sort of an impromptu press conference in front of the Capitol buildings in the US. And I'd received a lot of comments on that video. And I'd recorded a follow-up video to that addressing some of the comments last weekend. So it was a little bit more timely than this one is going to be. And unfortunately, through the process of having an iPhone that's full of videos, nearly packed storage, and doing some editing and not being happy with things and ping-ponging things back and forth, I accidentally deleted the original copy of the video, which is a little frustrating, obviously. And I don't have a lot of time, so I just had to bail on that project. So this is sort of going to be that, although in some ways I'm glad another week has passed because I've had a lot more time to think about, everything that sort of took place there. So first and foremost, I'm going to say, obviously I made the video in some haste, and a few of you pointed that out. And had I had more time to research, in particular, Dr. Emmanuel, I probably wouldn't have made the video at all. And we're going to discuss a little bit what I think about that. But she obviously not a particularly good spokesperson for the message that group of doctors was trying to put forth. And I would think possibly that maybe that group of doctors should have done a little more vetting of Dr. Emmanuel before she was invited to speak as well, because they could have avoided some of the things that come along with having someone like her that's got sort of, strange religious and voodoo kind of ideas out there. And a lot of you pointed that out. Now, and so that's the reason I wouldn't have made the video. The video was actually not to be meant to be some sort of full-throated endorsement of Dr. Emmanuel, however, and I received some criticism as though it were that, and it wasn't. The video was primarily meant to be a concern about censorship. And again, there's lots of avenues a person can go down when it comes to censorship with regards to YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the standard comebacks to that are going to be, well, they're private platforms. They can do as they wish. And I agree with that. As a person with certain libertarian bent, I would certainly agree with that. The issue is then they ought not to act like they are a platform and actually be a publisher and be treated as such legally. And they got a lot of house cleaning to do. I think you would have to agree if that were the case, because there are many things on there that could be considered hate speech and misleading and et cetera, et cetera. So they're being very selective about their sort of platform versus publisher stance. And the concern that I have has to do more with the slippery slope argument probably than anything else. And you could say, well, they have a responsibility to remove misleading information, which it has yet to be determined, I think, whether or not the information itself is misleading. And they've had no problem publishing misleading information as long as it comes from a sort of trusted source. And a lot of that information comes directly from Tony Fauci himself, from the WHO, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of problems there. But, we've seen, even in the time since then, the slippery slope in place. I think even J.P. Spears, basically kind of a comedian, he does some more serious videos, but most of his stuff is sort of meant to be comedic, having his videos censored. And that's going to continue. And it's going to continue until it's you. And then you're going to be shocked. Mark my words. Anyway, and that's the way all this stuff works, right? People say, oh, there's no such thing as a slippery slope. I've been guilty of it. I remember a long time ago, I used to watch Bill O'Reilly on Fox News. Ironically, right? I watched him and I'd yell at the TV the whole time. And he used to talk about a culture war, and he used to talk about different things as being the slippery slope. And I used to balk at that. He wasn't wrong. In retrospect, many of the things that he warned about as sort of the slippery slope argument, they're now commonplace. So, again, I shouldn't have made the video, not because the content was necessarily wrong, but because of the way that people took it, because of, in particular, Dr. Emmanuel. Now, I will say, when it comes to that, when someone says to me, oh, well, I bet you didn't know about Dr. Emmanuel when you made this video. Are you ready to apologize yet? Well, how fucking scientific of you. The efficacy of hydroxychloroquine against coronavirus, COVID-19, does not rest on the record or the beliefs of Dr. Emmanuel. Outside of that, and by the way, this is where the video gets a little more pithy. A few of you tried to police my language in that video. Stop saying CV. Now a couple of people joked about the use of CV. You know, are you talking constant velocity? I'm okay with that. Jokes are fine. But when people try to police my language in a video that's about censorship, the whole point was censors are afoot. So when I said CV instead of COVID-19, I was trying to avoid the algorithms that pick videos out by certain keywords, right? Sorry, cat is attacking my feet. So, I mean, come on, understand that, will you? Now, in this case, I'm going to say coronavirus, COVID-19, hydroxychloroquine, you name it, because I don't really care if this video gets taken down. Oh, by the way, that video I did turn unlisted. And the reason I did that, there's a couple of things I've always taken pride in on my channel. One, correcting the record when I'm wrong. So in this case, I would say it wasn't a good idea to upload that video. I'm not going to necessarily say that I was wrong, because I still believe that censorship is dangerous. I still believe that that the jury is not completely in on hydroxychloroquine. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And I'm happy to admit that I probably shouldn't have made the video based on the record of Dr. Emmanuel, not because she's wrong necessarily on the narrow focus of what those doctors were talking about, but because she's not a good spokesperson. Mostly because people will focus on voodoo instead of focusing on what she's talking about, which is what many of you have done. And again, that's not very scientific. I turned the video unlisted because I've also prided myself, when I make a correction, on leaving the original content up. I'm not trying to hide from anything. If I make a mistake, then then I'll correct it, and I'm happy to leave the record as it is. I think it's part of personal integrity to do that. Some of you, it would seem, are immune to human fallibility in the way that you've sort of approached me. It would seem as though you've never made an error. Now, the reason I turned the video unlisted rather than leaving it up is because until I did more research, I did not want to be guilty of continuing to promote false information. So I thought the thing that I could do that would maintain my integrity would be to turn it unlisted, so that the people who've engaged with me on that video could continue to do so and engage with each other, etc., etc. But I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm not turning it private or deleting the video. The other thing I've taken pride in my YouTube history is treating people fairly, treating people with respect, engaging people in the arguments and not making personal attacks, and not blocking people from commenting on my videos. To this day, I think I only have one person blocked, and that was an older Christian guy. I think his username was something like Raw3056, something like that. Any of you who've been with me long enough might remember a video where I made, it was like a live stream that I did with him, and he was sort of, I think I titled the video Raw Condemns Me to Hell or something like that, because we were arguing about things, and he was saying basically my beliefs or lack of beliefs in certain areas meant I was going to hell. And he would comment on my video, and for some reason, I don't know if he had something set where I was blocked to him or something. Somehow he was able to comment on my videos, but I couldn't reply to his comments. And I kept tagging him in separate comments saying, you better fix whatever block you've got going on there, or you're going to be blocked from commenting on the channel. And ultimately he didn't, so I blocked him. And that's the only reason I blocked him, is because I could not reply directly to his comments, and I wasn't going to stand for that. That's all going to change. I think no more Mr. Nice Guy is in order, because I don't appreciate actually the way some of you have come at me on a channel where people are saying, I've been with you a long time, but this time you've drunk the Kool-Aid, and it's sort of threatening to unsubscribe and stuff like that. Hey, if you want to unsubscribe, you know where the door is, first and foremost. I mean, maybe I've been too nice for too long, but I've got a channel here where I've always felt like this was a conversation. We're engaging here. If you think I'm wrong, then you come and talk to me respectfully. And if you've been with me for a long time, I think you'd know those things about me, that I am an evidence-based life form, that I engage in rational discourse, most importantly, respectful. And if you're going to not be respectful of me, if you're going to make claims that I've turned alt-right, make some sort of Trumpian arguments and say I've drunk the Kool-Aid and that I need to apologize, I'm not going to tolerate that. I'm simply not. And I think I have a good basis for that in that I don't treat people that way. Most of the time when I engage with people, even who are and I don't mind pithy arguments, by the way. I don't mind being challenged. That's different. That's different than being disrespected. I won't tolerate disrespect. I won't tolerate something from you in the comments section that I wouldn't tolerate if you were standing here next to me. And I wouldn't put up with that in person. So we're not going to do it here. Now, you're welcome to stay. Any of you have made, and some of you have been challenging to me in the comments section of that video. I will leave it up to you to determine whether you think you were being respectful or disrespectful. In other words, this may not apply to everyone who commented on that video. And in fact, to a lot of people, it doesn't. And I think if you parse the words in the comments and even maybe my responses to them, you can probably tell which side you fall into. Now, for those of you who've been disrespectful on the comment section of that video, you're welcome to stay, on the channel as a subscriber and a commenter, et cetera, just stop it. Okay, disrespect isn't going to be tolerated. You'll be blocked from commenting. That's the change we're making. I mean, this, if you think that the YouTube channel forms some sort of important component of my life, you haven't been paying attention to my upload rate, right? Because it's not very often that I upload videos. So I'm not going to put up with disrespect. This is a conversation. And again, pithy argumentation, that's fine. But if you want to start making accusations, anti-vaxxer, alt-right, and start talking about Trump as though I'm some sort of a Trump supporter, then you can find the door, because I'm not going to engage like that. We're engaging in arguments here. Now that that's out of the way. The video in question that we're talking about here really was sort of meant to be in two sort of components to it. One is censorship, and I've kind of dealt with that here. That's a conversation we could have, obviously, with regards to social media and then censorship in general. Obviously, there's sort of little c censorship and big C censorship. The big C censorship would be top-down governmental control of what people are and aren't allowed to say, hate speech and all of that. And then little c censorship, with regards to individual private companies and what they can and can't be allowed to do with respect, again, to publisher versus platform. So those things are all very interesting discussions. And I think, that's something that we could engage in. The other component, of course, to the video was the claims about the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. And the only point that I want to make on that, well, actually, there's probably several. I might get pithy here myself, and I don't mean any disrespect when I'm responding to a couple of the comments made by several of my detractors. Because the sort of the general consensus amongst a lot of the commenters on my videos, on the comments on that video, were of people who were saying, well, the science is in, and hydroxychloroquine is not an effective treatment to COVID-19. And also, some people had said that it's dangerous, that it causes heart issues, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say, just by the by, when you talk to a lot of doctors who've been prescribing hydroxychloroquine for a long time, this is completely news to them. These are people who've been prescribing it regularly for, I think it's Crohn's disease, and of course malaria, and there's other things that it's prescribed for. Not that they are unaware of this as a potential side effect, but none of them have ever had a patient who's had any certain conditions like that. So you have to wonder again about the political aspects of that. And by the way, a few of you have mentioned, again, alt-right and Trump supporter, the Trump and his group. And I'm apolitical when it comes to this stuff, right? We could get into my politics at some point. I think some of you know. I am not a Trump supporter. I'm not a Republican. I have many views that fall around the spectrum between classical liberal, libertarian, anarchist, and conservative. I mean, I'm kind of all over the map but those positions are individually, rationally derived. But I'm not partisan, even in the slightest. I think they're all crooks. And so Those of you who've brought politics in this to that degree, to the partisan end, that's on you, because that's not part of how I approach this. When I brought up Trump in the original video, what I was talking about was the political ramifications of him potentially being right, let's say, which, again, that's not scientific. It doesn't really matter what Trump endorses in that realm. It has no more bearing on whether or not the treatment is effective than Dr. Emmanuel's belief about demon sperm, right? Those things have nothing to do with the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. The other thing about hydroxychloroquine is, as far as I understand it, several of you had linked me to some recovery trials that had been done that did not show hydroxychloroquine being effective. In fact, if anything, within a statistical margin of error, it actually may have performed worse than not using it at all. But again, that was within the statistical margin of error. So that doesn't mean it is worse. It just means that it's probably not better than doing nothing or than a placebo. But what I didn't see in any of those trials, and maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, I did not see the particular use of hydroxychloroquine in the way that a lot of these doctors are saying it is effective. And that is used in conjunction with zinc and azithromycin. In particular, as far as I understand it, the idea being that zinc is a known antiviral, and hydroxychloroquine is sort of like a key that opens the door to the cell for zinc to get in there and do its antiviral business. And so if the recovery trials aren't utilizing zinc in particular, and maybe azithromycin as well, then that's not a test for what the doctors are claiming. And my point was, if there's a therapy that's being used that's working, then with the assertion that people need to always consult their doctor, which those doctors did, by the way, that this is something that perhaps people should know about so they can inquire with their doctor about whether this might be something that they could do, either as preventive or in the case that they're in an acute attack. And the thing is, one of my detractors in that video had said something on the order of, science can't prove anything in the positive, it can only prove things in the negative, which I found very interesting in light of some other things that person had said in other comments. Well, let's take that to its logical conclusion. Well, first of all, to say that science can only prove things in the negative, in other words, it can only prove, in this case, that hydroxychloroquine is not effective, well, that might be true, keeping in mind, first and foremost, that scientific truths are always held as provisionally valid. Right? There's no such thing as an absolute scientific proof. So as soon as somebody starts talking about the science is in, the science is settled, those sorts of things, those are non-scientific statements. They have nothing to do with the scientific method. There's no such thing as settled science. There is provisional science, and that's very practical for most purposes. We have a technologically advanced society because of provisionally true scientific facts, if you will. We have an airplane flying right overhead, small, single engine. They're not muffled. In any case, so that's provisionally true. New evidence, new things come to light. That scientific truth is subject to any new evidence, any new testing methods, anything that uncovers a flaw in the original study, anything like that. That doesn't mean that they're not, again, practical, that they're not very, very useful. And it also doesn't mean that they can't be accurate to an extremely high degree, right? But it does mean that we don't consider them as absolutes, first and foremost. Secondly, if something can be proven scientifically, again, that's when I say proven scientifically, I'm talking about that provisional truth, provisionally proven. It's only within the scope of the parameters of the particular test that's being done. Of course, you can't say that hydroxychloroquine cannot be beneficial in any way, shape, or form within the treatment of COVID-19. You can only say that within the parameters of that trial, it was not effective. If the trial doesn't include, obviously, other factors, then that trial has no bearing on those factors. Secondly, what I found interesting about that is I started thinking about what used to be considered the sort of the gold standards when it comes to diagnosis of disease, and that would be Koch's postulates, right? This sort of different ways of assessing whether or not something is causal in a disease formation. And the problem, I think, with Koch's postulates, you can look them up online, is that they're very rigid, and satisfying Koch's postulates in terms of the diagnosis of a disease really can be basically unethical, because part of Koch's postulates would basically essentially be, sort of isolating the component that you believe is causing the disease, and then, infecting a bunch of otherwise healthy people with it, and making sure that, 100% or nearly 100% of them develop the same disease within the same range of symptoms. It wouldn't have to be exact, but a range of symptoms that the original infected person had. And of course, that's not an ethical thing to do. There are animal analogs, but I would argue, and many scientists argue, of course, that those analogs are not 100% either. So satisfying Koch's postulates is not always that effective. But I would argue, actually, that because of some of the limitations of doing science, it may be possible to prove something to a higher degree of scientific accuracy in the positive, utilizing something like Koch's postulates, than it would be to prove it in the negative. In other words, if we were to move from, let's say, the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine to the proof that the coronavirus itself is the direct causal agent in COVID-19, in this SARS, the atypical pneumonia that has been deemed SARS-2, the only way you could prove that in the negative would be to eliminate every other possibility. And that's daunting. How do you do that? Because it wouldn't just be every bacterial and viral agent. You'd have to rule out any other potential environmental cause. I mean, there's lots of people talking about 5G. Well, those kind of things also would have to be ruled out. Maybe there's some radiation or something else that's causing a particular set of symptoms within a group of people in a given region. You'd have to rule all those things out in order to prove, to eliminate, to isolate the coronavirus as the causal agent. Whereas if you were to employ Koch's postulates, you might be able to actually prove it in the positive far more directly, if that was your original hypothesis for whatever reason. The other thing, pardon me, the other thing that this detractor of mine said at another point was, I think he said something to, this is this disrespectful stuff. He said something to me along the lines of, well, I can only hope that you never get coronavirus, COVID-19, and have to forget this argument or this discussion because you took Trump's advice. In other words, insinuating that, I guess because I'm a Republican American, which I'm neither of those things, that I would take my medical advice, that me saying that these doctors should be heard when it comes to the therapies that they're providing to their own patients, by the way, their claims are that it's effective, that Donald Trump had said that, so I would be directly taking Trump's medical advice without consulting my own doctor or my own brain, I guess, and that I'd have to forget this conversation because he told me in the conversation that hydroxychloroquine is not effective because he read some recovery trials. Well, first of all, I don't take my medical advice from Donald Trump. Second of all, and I did say in the video, just by the by, again, with this respect to people hacking at me for this video being some sort of a full-throated endorsement of those doctors, I said right in the video, if they are wrong and they're spreading misinformation, that ought to be investigated and their licenses taken away. I mean, either if what they're talking about is possibly true, then they ought to be allowed to speak. And if they're spreading misinformation that's potentially harmful, then they ought to have their licenses stripped. And I'll go a step further and say, I find it interesting that almost everybody seems to be incurious as to whether or not these doctors could actually be talking about a therapy that works, that's saving lives. And when I say everyone's incurious, obviously not a lot of people on the internet, but the people who are talking in my video. Nobody thought to ask the question out loud, what if they're doing something that works? They're claiming that they are. And you're completely incurious as to whether or not that might be true. And either way, it ought to be investigated, right? Because either they might have a therapy that works, and somebody ought to look into that and say, well, can we do a recovery trial study based on what you're doing that's different than what we've been doing? And if they find out that, no, that's not true, and actually they've been harming their own patients and now trying to amplify that by spreading that message elsewhere, then they ought to have their licenses revoked. But either way, it merits some investigation, which is something you could quote me for as having said in that video. Anyway, this person had said, I only hope you don't get coronavirus, so you'd have to forget this conversation since you took Trump's advice on your medical treatment, which is asinine and disrespectful and partisan. The same person who'd gotten into, Trump and penis, he was talking about, obviously, Vice President Pence. And, you discredit yourself when you talk like that, right? We're talking about adult conversations here, and this person had said to me, sorry, dude, you drunk the Kool-Aid. I've been with you for a long time, but you're way off on this one. It seems like you've gone crazy or something like that. And then you're going to talk about Trump and penis. You're discrediting yourself. So, I've always been one, and those of you who've been with me for a long time who know this, I've always been one to engage in a lot of introspection. And some of you have come at me as though you have there's no need for that on your end of things, that you're infallible, you're on the right side. I've jumped off into anti-vax, alt-right, Trump-loving, conspiracy theory territory, and I would submit to you that maybe some introspection is in order on your side of things. Anyway, we'll stop that. This person had said to me that maybe you'll get coronavirus, and I said, how would I know if I had COVID-19? Because, of course, there are a lot of issues with the current testing methodology that's being used. You can look up that. You can research it if you like. There are a lot of problems with it. It comes with a lot of criticism. It's highly inaccurate. So there's that aspect of things. But having said all of that, I wanted to draw this person out and tell me, well, you would get a test which would confirm, in the positive? That's interesting. I thought science couldn't prove anything in the positive. And so I said, how would I know if I had COVID-19? And he said, basically, well, you would take a test. You would have symptoms and then you would take the test. I'll leave it up to you to see the fallacy, the flaw in that argument based on other things that person has said. Look, here's the thing. I don't like when people say science. The science is in, the science is settled. When people say science without the word method, I have a problem with that, because now I realize it's shorthand and all of that, but it usually means that something is afoot. And usually it is followed by something like consensus or settled or something like that. And that's not how science works. I've always preferred to think of science in terms of the pure methodology, the scientific method. And people who are being honest about science will recognize and understand that science is held as provisionally valid, and that it's always subject to new information, better studies, et cetera, et cetera. So when people start talking in terms of absolutes, it gives me a lot of pause for concern. Again, obviously, I shouldn't have made the video. Dr. Emanuel is a terrible spokesperson. I would say, in terms of any degree of certainty, reasonable certainty, let's say, the question of hydroxychloroquine is not settled. There are a lot of doctors who are who've been, studying and treating people for 6 months or whatever now, utilizing this cocktail of hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and azithromycin to treat people, and they claim that they've been very effective in doing so. So until we have a study that eliminates that, I think it's something that ought to be looked into. The other thing I wanted to touch on just before I go, and that is this idea that I've turned into an anti-vaxxer. First of all, I'm not anti-vaccination. I will say, however, that I'm a vaccine skeptic. And if you're not, I think you should be, because there are a lot of issues when it comes to vaccines. Now, you can say that everything is a cost-benefit analysis, first and foremost, right? There's no free lunch when it comes to treating medical conditions. Everything has potential side effects, a lot of them which are unknown. In particular, I would say when you're talking about a vaccine technology that's never been made successfully before, fast tracking that is a bad idea. This is not the time to fast track something, especially when the case fatality rates, the death rates are dropping with respect to COVID-19. There's no reason to fast track a vaccine that is of a completely new technology that's never been tested before. That's not the one to fast track. So you got to be skeptical of that. The other thing is, too, I seem to be in this group of atheist, skeptic, scientific people. And a lot of times, the people that I converse with they're pretty skeptical. They're pretty critical of the gas and oil companies, for instance. Their lobbying power and, the revolving door between, let's say, different administrations, political administrations, and that industry itself, and obviously the military-industrial complex as well. But not so skeptical when it comes to Big Pharma, which is interesting to me. Big Pharma spends almost double what the gas and oil companies do on lobbying Washington. That ought to be food for thought, perhaps. There's also been very many known scandals and issues where pharmaceutical companies have knowingly foisted a dangerous drug on the public. So it's interesting to me that people have almost zero skepticism when it comes to Big Pharma or Tony Fauci. This one detractor of mine was talking about just follow Tony Fauci and you'll be good. You only have your life to lose or something like that. Well, first of all, I'm not dying of COVID-19 anytime soon, so you can stop with that, right? That's immature way to approach someone. And second of all, I mean, which Tony Fauci, the one who said don't wear a mask or wear a mask, or that it's not, we don't have human-to-human transmission, et cetera, or the Tony Fauci who's got his mask down on his chin? Is that the Tony Fauci that I should be following? Look, blind faith in anything, I think, is dangerous. So I think if we're in a skeptical community, you ought to be a little more skeptical of Big Pharma. And you ought to be more open-minded. The funny thing is, people think that being a skeptic means you have one squinted eye at everything. And that's not really the case. A part of skepticism is actually being skeptical of your own skepticism, right? Which is a long way of saying be open-minded first, but with a critical eye. You don't just dismiss something out of hand. You don't dismiss something out of hand because the person that it comes from you deem to be a flawed source, and you don't just accept everything that comes out of the mouth of someone that you deem to be an authority. That's not how skepticism works. Skepticism, I think, more honestly applied, is to listen to everything people say, from the authority to the Dr. Emmanuel. And you apply a skeptical filter to that. And you then look for verification as much as you can of anything that's said by anyone. Because, of course, even a broken clock can be right twice a day. Even the most disreputable person can actually have something to say that you might benefit from. Now, that's not to say that you wouldn't have a lot more skepticism towards someone who believes in demon sperm than someone who spent 40 years as a virologist. I granted, I have no problem with that. But you neither believe someone absolutely nor reject someone out of hand absolutely, and consider yourself to be a skeptic, because I don't think that's how that works. The world doesn't work that way, right? Somewhere in the middle generally lies the truth, and that's how I approach things. So from now on, just again, you're all welcome. From this day forward, I'll consider the slate clean and we go forward. However, anybody who disrespects me in the comments section of my videos, I'll probably issue a warning. Hey, cut that out. It's funny because I'll engage with people in a pithy way and challenge things. But when I do so, I usually will append my comment with cheers, because I want people to know that I'm coming at this in good faith, that I'm not trying to be hypercritical or anything like that. I'm not trying to attack them personally, and I want people to know that. One person had said something to me. It was not on one of my videos. It was on some comments I'd made on another video, and a person kind of said, "Oh, so you're saying, this kind of language, this and this and this?" And I thought, "Oh, this person's being disrespectful." And I said, that's not the way to engage. And I did answer his question, and then he responded by saying, "Oh, sorry, I didn't mean it that way." And I realized, okay, it was just unfortunate choice of words. And I said, "Hey, no worries, we're good." And I continued the conversation, and I appended it with cheers. And so, I might give you a warning, and if we can keep things on the up and up, then I'm happy to engage. But I've got too much going on in my life. I'm too busy of a person to be dealing with that kind of immaturity on my videos. I'm just not going to do it. So I fully expect, and in fact, I probably should expect, that my subscriber count is going to decrease as a result of this video. Good. If that's your response to sort of being told that I'm not going to put up with BS and you leave, you're doing us both a favor and you help me dodge a bullet. So thanks very much. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to the respectful comments in the comment section below.